Copyright, University of South Australia. This recording may contain third-party copyright material. Apart from any use permitted under the Copyright Act 1968, no part of this recording may be reproduced or rebroadcast by any means or process without the prior written permission of the University of South Australia and the copyright owners.
The second part of your task for this week is to label and understand the function of different components of the internal pelvic organs and reproductive organs. So this is a mid-sagittal slice of the female, and the one below is a slightly off-center parasagittal slice of the male. So what we're going to have a go here is labeling these things and writing a few functions about them, as well as labeling a few of the other structures that you can see in the region. So here, initially, we can see the ovary, and the ovary is responsible for production of female hormones. So an example of that is estrogen, and then also the monthly production of eggs. So 1 month, the left one will produce an egg, and the other month, the right one will produce an egg. The next structure that we see here, as we're coming downstream, so this structure coming off to this from the ovary is our uterine tube. The uterine tube has many different components, but I'm not expecting you to know that. But the initial part here, these fingers, we call the fimbriae. They would carry the egg down along the fallopian or uterine tube until it reaches the proximal end here nearby this structure we call as the uterus. The uterus has a few different parts. It's a muscular sac, whereby at this end we call this cap, or the flexed end here, as the fundus. This area here we call the body, and at this area down here, where you can see that it's meeting with the vaginal canal and has a slightly rougher appearance, this end we call the cervix. So these three parts here of the uterus, when there is no fetal growth inside, the uterus sits superior to the urinary bladder, and during the 9 months of pregnancy, the uterus will grow all the way as far as touching the bottom end of the sternum. See here, this is what we have as the urinary bladder. So make sure we call it the urinary bladder, not just the bladder, because we do have a gallbladder in our body, and you wouldn't just call that the bladder. So now we need to call this one the urinary bladder. So the urinary bladder will store urine until you're reaching about 200, 300, 400 mils, and then expulsion of the urine would go via here. This is your urethra. So the female urethra here is approximately 4 to 6 centimeters in length, which does mean that it makes it a little bit more vulnerable when considering any types of urinary tract infection when comparing it to the male. But here we can see from the neck of the bladder where you would find your internal urinary sphincter. So this one would be shut under sympathetic control and open under parasympathetic control. The urethra passes from the neck of the bladder out to the vaginal vestibule where urine would be eliminated. The structure that we can see just posterior to that is here. So this is the vagina. Now the vagina or vaginal canal that you can see here passes from the vaginal vestibule here, and its os, so the opening, passes up posteriorly to the bladder and the urethra, but anterior to this structure here we know as the rectum. So the rectum is your final terminal portion of the digestive system, where you would have your solid waste waiting. But what we can see here about the vagina is that as it passes up, it will meet with the uterus and the cervical portion of the uterus, and so this is how sperm would make its way up and toward the uterus. Structure D here is the terminal, very end terminal portion, right, whereby the smooth muscle will meet with the area of skin on the distal end of your digestive system. This here, from this point, about this curvature, to the area on the external surface of the body, we call this one the anal canal. And the skin area is named the anus. Some of the other things that we can see in this area, this blue structure here is representative of the pubic symphysis. So we know that the pubic symphysis is the structure we would find between the two pubic bones. And this is separated here by the blue structure, which is a fibrocartilaginous disc. If we have a look at the male here now, we have similarities and differences. So the ovary that we would have seen in the female is replaced by the testes in the male. So the testes, which are existing on the external aspect of the body rather than on the internal aspect of the body. From there, this structure here, this grey cap that you find on top of the testes, on its posterior and lateral aspect, we call this one the epididymis. From there, passing upwards as a tube, coming in this direction like this is where we find the vas or ductus deferens, which is an interchangeable term. So vas deferens or ductus deferens. This would carry the developed and developing sperm up from the epididymis, now back inside the body, running across the superior aspect of the urinary bladder, and coming in contact with this structure here, we call the seminal vesicle. The seminal vesicle is responsible for producing approximately 70% of the fluid associated with an emission. So this seminal vesicle produces what we call as the semen. Here we can see that we labelled the rectum above, just anterior to the sacrum and the coccyx in the females. Same here in the males. B, label marker, is the rectum, so storage of your solid waste. Once the vas deferens would pass by the seminal vesicle here, it would come into the back of this glandular piece of tissue. This is what we call as the prostate gland, whereby the prostate gland is responsible for producing prostatic fluid. And this prostatic fluid has a protective and nourishing function for the sperm. So it protects them from the outside environment. So as an example, because beyond this point here, the urethra is a shared tube, so urine coming from the urinary bladder and semen and sperm coming from the reproductive system here, the prostate gland will produce a slightly basic solution so that the sperm are not denatured by the acidic pathway through the urethra, as well as to protect it from any white blood cells that would be found in the vaginal canal when deposited. So, some major differences that we have between the male and the female is obviously that the primary reproductive structure, the testes or the ovary, testes is on the outside, ovary on the inside, but produces those haploid cells for reproduction. What we can see here as well is that we have a union whereby you have urine and reproductive structures following the same pathway to the end of the penis via the urethra. But in the female, we can see that the urethra and the vagina are completely separate. So we have a different pathway for urine and reproduction. Thanks.